I had a long, meaningful, passionate delivered, but largely ignored video talking about public monuments and government policy for the arts just a few days ago. Many of you missed it. Remarkably few people watch it, compared even to Melissa's analysis of the importance or lack of importance of music in education. And, you know, in following up afterwards, I shared with my Patreon subscribers one of the most hilarious and the most awful examples of public art here in Victoria, Canada, perhaps anywhere in Canada, perhaps anywhere in the world. And it's a giant metal sign, and it's placed on quite a busy road. It's in quite a prominent place. Like you'd think it was advertising wording, the way this sign is set up. It's in the middle of a park. These are your taxpayers' dollars at work. And it is proudly proclaiming, every time you walk past it, night is for sleeping. New sentence. Day is for resting. So this is literally a monument to laziness. This is letting you know every time you walk past this, if you live in this neighborhood, you're seeing this. Oh, the fact that nighttime is for sleeping doesn't mean that you need to be alert and hardworking during the day. No, no, no. Night is for sleeping. Day is for resting. Your taxpayers' dollars at work. Now, if you live in the United States, if you live in Europe, you might get sick of seeing patriotic slogans, declarations about, you know, feeling grateful for our troops. You might just feel you're seeing this message a little bit too often. I've got to tell you, the most saccharine, the most tear-jerking statement about war, wounded people coming back from Afghanistan would be so much more meaningful than this government-sponsored statement that night is for sleeping, day is for resting. I would gladly see that sign replaced with, you know, an image of a limping soldier who's been wounded by a landmine who returned from Afghanistan, and a statement they fought so that Afghan people could have democracy, or whatever propaganda slogan. Like, on the in terms of propaganda, I could tolerate. How about a statement about sobriety? How about a statement about hard work or staying in school? Mr. T. Is anyone else here old enough to remember Mr. T? Mr. T managed to get, you know, stay off drugs, stay in school. Stay in school, kids. Stay in school, kids. I don't think Mr. T himself stayed in school. Mr. T, the original high school dropout, going around telling you, keep your nose clean. Stay in school, kid. Stay out of trouble. Hey, kids, stay out of trouble. Stay in school. Don't be a fool. Stay in school. Put that on a metal sign. I wouldn't. Oh, Jesus. Day is for resting. Night is for sleeping. This is a public art monument, taxpayer-sponsored monument. And this is the capital city of Western Canada, capital city of British Columbia. Woo! Monument to laziness. All right. The reason why I make this live stream, maybe a short live stream, maybe a long, is to reply to a letter from a supporter of the channel on Patreon and a member of the audience, first name Danny. I'm going to read this now. I'm going to think about it a little bit. I'm going to talk about a few other issues, and then I will come back to this a little bit later. So people who join later, when I reply to this question, they won't be totally thrown off. So Danny writes in, and this part of the letter is also kind of interesting. He says, as of today, I've been watching your channel content for half a year, and I learned a lot. So this is also interesting. I hear from people who've been watching the channel for 6 years, in this case, 6 months. But, you know, you hear from people who joined at different points in time, and it influenced their lives in different ways. And also people who started watching at different ages. I've had letters from people who say to me, they started watching my channel when they were 15, and now they're 20. You know what I mean? This is like an influence at this crucial time of life. Anyways, this guy writes in, he's been watching for half a year. Today, I finally decided to support you on Patreon, as I appreciate your content. I know you're not a fan of making book recommendations and handing out reading lists, but I value them. And right now I'm in the process of reading your recommended list that you gave to Melissa. So this includes Xenophon, Aristotle, etc. So that's also interesting to me. Quite a few people, as many as 5, is it as many as 10 yet? People have written in and said that this video or series of videos I made talking to Melissa, well, it's me talking to the fact that Melissa, I put her on this kind of catching up with the university education you should have had but didn't have. You know, I made this this special reading list for Melissa, and we read it together. So many of the books, maybe all of them, I had read before. There might have been one or two things in there I hadn't read before. I forget. But in any case, I didn't just hand the reading list to her, but we read them together and we talked about them together and made some YouTube videos talking about it along the way. Not as many YouTube videos came out of that as you might suspect. I think the title of that video is "Why I Am Forcing You to Read Aristotle." Is that it? Okay, so we can get that. Is that going to be shadow banned on YouTube? At my channel, am I going to get a lot of stuff? Anything to do with autism is banned on my channel. Sorry, but we'll talk about this. Okay, so there you go. So we presume that is the right video. So fully 3 years ago, watched by 1,500 people, "Why I Am Forcing You to Read Aristotle." So I think that's me talking through, look, so James is in the audience, and James says that he also started with that recommended reading list. So it is rare, we'll talk about that a little bit more in this video, it is rare that I recommend somebody read something. But in that case, I worked through that list with Melissa, and it's interesting to hear that other people have changed their lives. Now, I'm also, look, let's also do some follow-up here. I think that reading list profoundly changed Melissa's life. I think Melissa has changed a lot and matured a lot as a human being in the last 3 years. And I don't think the effects came about right away. Like, I don't think reading Thucydides the first time when you did had an impact immediately. But maybe later, as the years go by and you see how it connects to other things and other questions, getting at those real fundamental roots of the origin of democracy in the ancient West and in the modern West, like maybe, it took some time to percolate. But yeah, I think it's had a big impact on Melissa and who she is as a person in her life. And it's informed and enriched. It has informed and enriched later reading that she's done and so on. So yeah, anyway, interesting to hear that's still having consequences for fans of the channel 3 years on. Anyway, so that is, depending on who you are and what you want to know, it is still an important video to watch and a useful reading list. So he says, quoting this letter from Danny, "My main concern in reading this list and eventually getting to Aristotle is to gain a greater understanding of politics and philosophy in parallel. All over the internet are lists and charts that contain many influential persons and philosophers. Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and many others leading up to 20th century thinkers. From your position, is it worthwhile to delve into this large corpus of the Western canon in order to understand the legacy of the ancient Greeks in our modern world as politics? Question mark. Are some thinkers more worthy than others? Question mark. The big picture question that I couldn't find a concrete answer to is, why are all of these thinkers being taught in universities? It's a very good question, and nobody's going to give you the honest answer. Why should I or society care for them? Should I skip them or read a select few? Okay, so let's start with something that's parallel, remarkably different, but important in some of the same ways. I had email from somebody. I'm sorry, I actually forget who this was, but some longtime viewer of the channel wrote into me. Probably wouldn't be useful for me to tell you his name or anything else about him anyway, but there was a guy writing in and talking about enrolling in an advanced university course in Buddhism. And this was at a big, famous, respectable university somewhere in the United States. It wasn't a small college, but even the largest universities in Europe and America, they will generally have just one professor who does Buddhism. Generally, it's rare to have two professors. That's a large department of Buddhist studies. So, even if they have a very robust Asian studies or religion and history of Asia department, they'll try to have one guy who does Hinduism, one guy who does Buddhism, right? Maybe one guy who does Islam, whatever, but they divide it up this way. So you are lucky to have one specialist in Buddhism at the university at all, but maybe two maximum. So he enrolled in this course. Now, okay, if you're taking university level studies in Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist history, Buddhist politics, what do you read? What if the entire course is nothing but Japanese Pure Land Buddhism? So this would be like you enroll in a class in Christianity, and there's only one professor of Christianity, and the entire course is just about American Mormonism. Christianity did not originate in the United States of America. Mormonism is neither the earliest nor the most representative nor the most influential form of Christianity. This is a minor sectarian variant that comes in very late in the history, and it's very far removed geographically, culturally, and linguistically from the origins of what Christianity are about and why Christianity is so important. So you'd say, this is completely ridiculous. Obviously, there's just one professor who's like a cult member, who's a true believer in Mormonism, and he's perverted this department to teach nothing but Mormonism, as if that's the whole history of Christianity. Yeah, this happens in Buddhist studies, and it happens in myriad ways. If someone is going to be an eccentric, it's nice if they don't keep it hidden. All right. We had a professor at the University of Toronto who wore a kilt every time he gave a lecture. There's a man wearing a traditional Scottish dress. Okay, the word I wanted to use was dress. It's a kilt, but okay, it's a man's dress. Okay, and he was of the persuasion that the true inner essence of Calvinism, of the Scottish Protestant tradition of Calvinism, and the philosophy of Buddhism were one and the same. That like the secret doctrine, the inner essence, if you could understand it, Buddhism, and he would stand there in a kilt giving these lessons. So what do you think the assigned reading list was? What do you think this guy is teaching? Well, this is real. All right. Now, there have been other professors at the University of Toronto, and he could be asked, are they more or less insane? Other people, are they more or less eccentric? The other professors who have taught Buddhism just at that same university. I could now name them and start calling out their bizarre ideological inclinations. Right, so what were some of the examples here? Yes, Immanuel Kant, somebody like Nietzsche. He mentions Descartes, Hegel. Okay, and by contrast, here's a name that's not in your university reading list. Here's a name you probably haven't seen. Here's Condorcet. So that title has it in kind of handwritten scripts. And there you go. Condorcet modernity. Condorcet. You ever heard of this guy? Like universally acknowledged as a genius, universally acknowledged as one of the most important people in the history of his century or the history of Western civilization. And yet for some reason, he's not on any of those reading lists next to a fascist like Nietzsche or kind of crypto-fascist like Hegel. Another one I don't have a book for, Thomas Hobbes. Why does Thomas Hobbes matter? I thought Hobbes was in this list, but he doesn't mention. Who decides who's important? Is Hobbes in there? Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So Hobbes does make an appearance in the email. Okay. Okay. So briefly, slavery, kind of a big deal. Whether or not women have the right to vote, kind of a big deal. Now, slavery, it's a little bit too broad. Let's say more specifically and especially the legal equality of Black people, which goes beyond the issue of slavery. It's also in some ways more specific, right? Like there can be slavery of people who aren't Black. There's slavery within the history of Sri Lanka. There's slavery within the history of Thailand. But let's talk about white Europeans enslaving Black people and the consequences. Condorcet here is what you would have called ahead of his time. Condorcet thought that Black people should have all the same civil rights as white people. He thought that Black people should be able to marry and have children with white people. Condorcet thought women should be able to vote. Women should be able to debate, politics and participate in democracy just like men. Condorcet was on the kind of modern leading edge of a whole bunch of important ideas and questions, and he had a lot of challenging, useful things to say about democracy. Why do you think it is that Nietzsche, who's much closer to modern this, centuries later, and this is before and during the French Revolution, Nietzsche is a significant series of generations later. Why do you think that someone like Hegel, someone like Nietzsche, or someone like Hobbes is held up as the important philosopher for us to read that's so important and meaningful for our times, right? And there's other forms of kind of highly eccentric propaganda that creep into these problems. Now, Machiavelli is actually a tremendously important political philosopher for the history of democracy in Europe, but also in the United States of America. I have a very large, very heavy book here, which you don't need to buy, you don't need to read. But this book exists so you can cite it and say, oh yeah, in case you don't believe my claim that Machiavelli is really important for the history of democracy in America, I can tell you about this book. I can give you a footnote citing this book, The Machiavellian Moment by J.G.A. Pocock. yes, as Pocock established, Machiavelli's importance for the democratic tradition in both England and the United States of America can hardly be overstated. It's tremendously important, tremendously influential. And what side of these debates was Machiavelli on? He was fundamentally a modernizer, fundamentally a democratizer, fundamentally, trying to find a way to revive the best aspects of republicanism from the ancient world in what was then the modern world or the contemporary world, right? Who was Thomas Hobbes, and why does Hobbes matter? Right? Sorry, I'm going to come back to trying to addressing his question directly. All right. I don't hand out recommended reading for this reason. Okay. If I know you, if I know what you're trying to learn, if I know what your research project is, maybe I can tell you something really meaningful and really important about what it is you're doing. You know what I mean? Like maybe I can make a recommendation for you. I'm not going to make recommendations for all mankind or something. And like, who is it who can pretend that Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes is meaningful for all people, for all mankind? If you had a friend born and raised in Japan who tells you they're trying to understand the European democratic tradition, like what went on in ancient times and what went on now, would you tell your Japanese friend, well, Thomas Hobbes? Would you tell your Japanese friend, oh, Friedrich Nietzsche? And who else was like, oh, how about Immanuel Kant? There's a fucking laugh. Jesus Christ. Would you tell them to waste their time going back and reading those thinkers? And, and if so, why? What is it they're supposed to learn? What is it they're supposed to gain from it? Now, conversely, someone might have a very specific interest that would motivate them to read and appreciate Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is a minor footnote in the history of the English Civil War. And we have an educational tradition, high school and university, where we don't teach kids anything about the English Civil War. At most, so I can ask Melissa, did you learn like even the name of the French Revolution? Did you get like a 2-sentence?
Yeah.
Okay, so so your history education in high school, they included a unit on the French Revolution or what?
I wouldn't say a unit, but in probably not the 9th grade.
Okay.
Mentioned
so there was a paragraph or something in the history textbook. Okay, but now so that's the French Revolution. Now, what about the English Revolution, aka the English Civil War, which is approximately 1 century earlier? Okay, I'm from a British colony, and we didn't get 1 sentence. We didn't get 1 word about it. Okay, so the real story, the real political, philosophical questions at the time, all the stuff that really matters, none of that's included in our education. But without any of this context, we're given the bizarre spectacle of the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. Now, if you just pick up a copy of Hobbes' Leviathan and leaf through it, or like look at the table of contents and kind of glance at it, you'll think, whoa, about 50% of this book is this guy's bizarre interpretation of the Bible. That's what it is. All right. Now, the whole English Civil War took place in a period of time that we could call the Puritan uprising, the blossoming forth of what we now in retrospect call Puritanism. Now, like Puritanism as a concept only makes sense kind of looking back at history. If you were alive at that time, there are a whole bunch of different religious sects and movements and orders that don't consider themselves one and the same movement. But now, and they all wore funny hats, right? And now we call them Puritans. And it's especially from an American perspective that they're called Puritans, because many of them, when the English Civil War came to an end, were uncomfortable and went to America. No, sorry, to be fair, some of them were also uncomfortable before the English Civil War and went to America. And now, long story short, guys, you had a period of internecine religious carnage. And at the end of it, broadly speaking, there was a mood of returning to Orthodox Anglicanism. People are like, whoa, we tried this thing with everyone coming up with their own wacky heterodox interpretation of the Bible. And you know what? The English Book of Common Prayer isn't that bad, right? People went through the process of, entertaining wacky heterodox new ideas from people like Thomas Hobbes, people like Oliver Cromwell himself. People went through a brief period of thinking, maybe the church doesn't have a monopoly on the truth. maybe each of us can be better Christians, alone with our own personal relationship with God, directly praying and directly reading the scripture and coming up with our own ideas. And you know what it led to? It led to banning and burning the English Book of Common Prayer. It led to banning Christmas. I'm an atheist. I'm completely in favor of banning Christmas. But these people were banning Christmas and banning the English Book of Common Prayer because they were too Christian for it. They were too puritanical for it, thus the term Puritans. Now, in our own time, this is not so different. I mean, okay, it is different. But you could say this is somewhat similar to the way that Jehovah's Witnesses in the United States of America refuse to celebrate Christmas, refuse to celebrate Halloween. They say no, they want to really strictly stick to what it says in the Bible and this kind of thing. Okay? So this is what on. Now, okay, so if you ask me what's interesting about Thomas Hobbes, what's interesting about Hobbes' Leviathan, and this is a younger person. I don't know how old this person is. He doesn't state his age. This is someone who's been watching my channel for 6 months. They seem kind of young. They seem like they're. I don't know if this is someone who's already been to university and is trying to compensate for all things they didn't learn in university, or it's someone who hasn't been to university yet. I really don't know. It might be interesting to just know roughly how old or how young Danny is. It could be a 50-year-old person from the style of writing. I'm guessing this is a young person. I guess also the self-portrait he has with the email suggests to me he's a younger person. Yeah, it's a cartoon, but still it doesn't look like an older person's cartoon. But anyway, presuming this is a younger person, asking this question, like, oh, well, Thomas Hobbes is really important. Well, politically, Thomas Hobbes is a total dead end. Philosophically, he's a total dead end. He represents a kind of branch that went off from the mainstream and was a total failure and went absolutely nowhere. Now, someone like Machiavelli fundamentally says that he worships and respects the ancient Greek sources, the ancient Roman sources. He has this admiration for antiquity. He describes himself as being in dialogue with antiquity. But of course, he does also present his own new and genuinely edgy ideas about politics, about morality, about the future, about how they should have a republic now. And he is not lacking the self-confidence to really point out when those ancient sources are wrong, in his opinion. There are, where he says, no, well, this is what the ancient Romans say, but here's where they're wrong. Here's what you need to know to run a polity, to run a kingdom or a republic, in his own time in Italy. Okay, so but fundamentally, tremendous admiration for Aristotle and all of the ancients. Thomas Hobbes is the one guy who says that no, it's all bullshit. Thomas Hobbes is the one guy who says, this is from memory, but this is not far off from a verbatim quote. He says, nothing has been bought at so dear a price in human blood as the learning of ancient tongues. He says, you people, you read Livy, you read Sallust, you read Appian, whatever. You read these ancient Latin historians, you read Aristotle. What was it? Of Aristotle, he said, has there ever been a worse teacher? You get these notions into your head about freedom and human rights, or natural rights, whatever. You get this discourse about freedom and democracy and rights, and then you guys all slaughter each other for nothing, and guess what? Your whole ideology is bullshit. Now, look, I'm a nihilist. There's a certain perspective from which you can kind of get on the roller coaster ride of Thomas Hobbes's insanity and kind of appreciate it for what it is. It's this total dead end. He rejected all of the elements that went into the construction of what you could call modern capitalism, modern liberalism, modern democracy. He said, nope, wrong. And instead, he has this kind of fundamentally authoritarian interpretation of scripture. And based on his understanding of the Bible and based on his understanding of human nature, he says, look, this is how it is. This is the reality of politics. Now, I say it's fundamentally authoritarian. I could argue about the limited role for personal freedom and personal happiness in the system, but this is not supposed to be an hour-long lecture on the political philosophy of Hobbes. But, I admit, put it this way. Hobbes does not believe that a human being is a bee that exists only to serve the queen, He doesn't believe that you are a worker ant that exists only to serve the colony. That's not his philosophy. However, he totally rejects democracy. He totally rejects all these ideas about freedom and liberty and rights and even consultation with government. He rejects all of it. He says it's all wrong. So what's interesting about this? And why is a Christian fundamentalist maniac like Thomas Hobbes, why is he taught as being so important and not Condorcet? Why is Condorcet forgotten? Because he really is. I mean, this is a brand new book, and the introduction is basically saying, oh, Condorcet has been almost completely forgotten. This one too, the introduction, more or less, they talk about this. Oh, well, Condorcet used to be one of the most important people in the history of Western civilization, but he's been completely dropped out of the curriculum. Nobody's heard the name. Nobody's okay. Well, look, I can now tell you a bunch of things that are bad about Condorcet. I can engage in a critique of Condorcet. I can tell you things he was wrong about and stupid about, and disadvantages of his philosophical and political worldview. Okay, but this was a guy who was taking democracy seriously. He was taking women's rights seriously. I think, okay, is it too much to say that he was an atheist? I have, maybe this has a chapter on that. How close to being an atheist was Condorcet? That I don't know. But he certainly was at least a free thinker. Now, at that time, if you were an atheist, you had to keep your cards close to your chest. Machiavelli, I mean, this was published after his death. It is completely obvious that he's an atheist. If you've read this, Machiavelli's this, there is no way this guy has even a shred of faith. This is much more explicit, in my opinion, than The Prince. But nevertheless, he lived in a society where if you were an atheist, you had to keep your cards close to your chest. You kind of have to pay attention. But no, that doesn't interest us. I mean, the religiosity of Thomas Hobbes, it's in many ways more like Judaism, or it's a form of highly eccentric Judaism than it is Christianity. And that was part of the spirit of what was going on with Puritanism. People were reading the whole Bible and realizing the New Testament was just one part of it, and they were getting inspired by and interested in the Jewish Old Testament material there. So I just say, okay, right, guys, look, okay, we have a troll in the comments section again. I don't mind if you want to criticize me. I don't even mind if you want to troll me, but you've got to rise to my level. Okay. So if you want to come in here and you want to troll or you want to disagree, it's great. Read Hobbes, read Condorcet. This is the level we're operating on. If you want to tell me I'm wrong and I don't want to talk about it, great. I would love that. I would love to have people in this comment section crossing swords with me, but you've got to be producing comments that are really worth answering. Someone can come in and say and criticize the Machiavellian moment by Pocock and take this conversation in a whole different direction. Okay, so I'm gonna return to. So I'm just glancing at the comments here, but it looks like there's nothing you guys really want me to. Okay. Radical centrist says, you used the phrase, how we know what we know in regards to the beginning of economics as a science. Do you remember the video, or can you repeat those names? Sorry, it sounds like an interesting question, but I'm not really sure what you're getting at. I assume you're talking about some video where I talked about a reading list, what you would read if you're interested in the origins of the European tradition of economics. I assume. But, So Almighty Ohm says, so much is a product of its time. So many treat philosophy chapter and verse, i.e. treat it like a religious text. No solution without compromise. I liken it to Buddhism, sex, chapters. Okay, look, what I'm addressing here is in some ways shallower and some ways deeper than what you're saying here, Ohm, because I'm asking the question, why would Danny read any of these texts? Why would they matter to him? Why would they be useful to you here and now? That's different. Like, okay, I mean, Descartes, why would it possibly be rewarding or worthwhile for you to do the research to understand the scientific, religious, intellectual, and political context surrounding the philosophy of Descartes? Why? Like, what is the point? And, in our culture, students aren't allowed to ask that. Now, I can give you a bunch of reasons very easily as to why Condorcet is worth knowing about. I can give you a bunch of reasons why Napoleon, the French Revolution, that whole period, why that's worth knowing about. Now, likewise, if you're talking about the American Revolution, obviously, even if you find it boring, it really matters. Like, we could talk about why the American Revolution still matters today, and the philosophers and political debates that went into writing the American Constitution. There's a very clear relevance there. But, you're talking about Descartes. So what? Again, actually, Descartes, it's similar to what I was saying about Hobbes. So I trailed off by saying Hobbes' religious views are in some ways closer to Judaism, but it would be a very eccentric form of Judaism. But he was in some ways getting back to the roots of the first few books of the Old Testament, a view of the world in which God is seen as having a physical body like a human being with hands and feet, which he has in the Old Testament. It's a very different kind of cosmology. Now, are you interested in an eccentric Christian, and what was going on, Immanuel Kant? Whenever I've met people who claim Immanuel Kant is this tremendously important philosopher, and let me just say briefly, what he says about politics is horseshit, by which I do not mean to insult horseshit, perfectly good source of fertilizer. Immanuel Kant's philosophy is worse. This man knew nothing about politics. He had no wisdom to offer on such politics. Immanuel Kant, racist to his bones. He was a small town, bigoted, stupid racist, and his works are full of it. He wrote on quote unquote anthropology. He popularized the fourfold division of races. And gee, what do you know? Do you think he felt that white people were the inferior race? Do you think he felt that German people were the inferior race? Oh no, conveniently, his interpretation of the races of the world, none of whom he has ever met. He never left the small town in Germany he grew up in. He has no experience with politics, no experience with war, no experience with anything, no interest in anything, and no interest in meeting or getting to knowing or like learning to respect Chinese people or Arab people or African people. But he wants to sit there with his pen and write these kind of racist condemnations of them. Now, guys, I'm saying this about Immanuel Kant. It's not just ad rem. It's also ad hominem. Like what we're saying about his character as a man and what we're saying about, the value of his work, they're inextricable. They're one and the same. This tells you something about who Immanuel Kant is. Well, sorry, whenever I meet people who think Immanuel Kant's philosophy is tremendously important, I ask them, so what was the thesis of Critique of Pure Reason? Why did he write the book? Why was he motivated to write the book? Like what is, in common English, what is the point of Critique of Pure Reason? And you have to understand, it's stated, by the way, in the introduction that apparently none of them have read. Like it's stated from Immanuel Kant. The Critique of Pure Reason is a defense of Christian faith. And it's not even as useful as studying official church doctrine and understanding like the wars that were going on between different sects of Christianity at that time. Like that was what was going on in mainstream Christianity. It's this nebbish, it's this guy in a small town whose opinions don't matter, really has nothing interesting or significant to say. And, he is constructing this worldview and presenting you with this epistemology, presenting you with these comments on how the mind works and how we observe and know and learn from reality so that he can defend faith against reason. And that is even in the title. So in the title and the introduction, and I meet all these people who are university educated and have studied Kant, and they come away saying, oh, Immanuel Kant is tremendously important. And, hilariously or tragically, they can't say why. They don't know why. Now, this tells you something about the people, and it tells you something about our education system, and it tells you something about the bizarre agenda to try to promote German cultural supremacy after the end of World War II, which is that they rummaged through, the jewelry box of German philosophers and tried to find somebody who wasn't too fascist, somebody who wasn't too racist, wasn't too anti-Semitic, wasn't too evil, to make into a great philosopher so that we'll all think of Germany, 19th century Germany, as the Athens of modern Europe, as the pinnacle of intellectual development in modern Europe, which it is not. Immanuel Kant was not intelligent. He was not brilliant. His works still today are not worth reading. If you're in his own time, were not perceived as being worth reading. Immanuel Kant didn't discover anything. And what is he credited with? Oh, he's credited with inventing the idea of the United Nations because he wrote an essay called On Perpetual Peace that any high school child, could write today, So anyway. Okay, so I'm just going to look at some of the comments here. Not a question, just a comment. So this is quoting Noel. I learned so much from this channel. Very thought-provoking content. Thank you. So Frida comments that especially law professors make students read Kant and Kelsen. It's weird. So a totally worthwhile comment from Almighty Om again. A critique or an analysis tends to say more about the observer than the observed. Yes, but you know, life is only so many years long. I have books that are literally underneath the camera right now. I have books propping up the camera that I would love to read, and I don't have time. I got some email from an old friend, we don't talk anymore, with a PhD, that was asking me really technical questions about philosophy of Immanuel Kant. This is about a year ago. And I remember it's like it all came back to me. A couple people have commented in response to Melissa's recent video that they studied the cello as a child and now they don't remember it at all, or they studied piano and they don't remember how to do it and it doesn't contribute anything to their lives. But I gotta tell you, a lot of that philosophy I studied in the past, like and including Immanuel Kant, it's amazing that it does come back to me. That I was like, oh yeah, I remember all these bizarre technical terms in German. I studied German briefly, but you know, I did learn some German. I learned German for reading philosophy and so on. And oh yeah, and I can talk about this stuff. But I mean, you know, life is only so long. And if what is worth knowing about Thomas Hobbes is that he is a footnote and a kind of dead-ended digression in the history of the English Civil War, then you are much better off reading a political history of the English Civil War in which perhaps Thomas Hobbes will be mentioned in a few paragraphs or maybe in a footnote, right? Like that's what's significant about him. Now, with someone like Descartes, I can't even put him in that kind of context. Like I can't even say, oh, well, there's some important political or philosophical story that Descartes is a moment in, and you should read this other book, and then Descartes is going to have his paragraph or his position. I mean, like, from my perspective, Descartes' significance is, you know, entirely. It's not just an exaggeration; it's kind of fiction. It's whole cloth fiction. Sorry. So Lilac Cloud writes in, I did some philosophy in high school in the UK, and the emphasis on Kant and Descartes really confused me. Right. Okay. So why is that? So look, Lilac Cloud, welcome to the audience. I don't remember. I'd remember you because you have such a memorable name. Okay. I've met people. I've met British people face to face, and their whole struggle in life was Christianity, was that they were raised to believe in the Christian church and this certain kind of intellectual approach to rationalizing the Christian church. And they took kind of baby steps towards atheism. And Kant and the critique of reason, and Descartes, and these little challenges step by step, and reading some of the church fathers, I don't know, reading St. Augustine and some of this crap too. You know, and this was their formal training in philosophy. And some of them stuck with it. Some of them really became lifelong committed Anglicans. They became committed to the rationalization of faith, you know, coming out of that tradition. And some of them instead, you know, would eventually turn to somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche, you know, someone who to me is a joke philosophically. Is really, you know, this is not even a philosopher to me. To me, this is like a, you know, newspaper columnist just mouthing off opinions. There's really no philosophy to it. And some of them, you know, that process of studying Immanuel Kant, it led them to being willing to accept some of these, you know, genuinely anti-Christian. So look, it's no excuse, but it's an explanation. Before, at the start of this conversation, I gave the example of a department of Buddhist philosophy where you're not studying the actual teaching of the Buddha. You're not learning about Buddhism in India. The whole course is just devoted to one bizarre branch of Buddhism that only exists in Japan, right? Okay, well, this is kind of weird. And, you know, the Japanese language is not Pali and is not Sanskrit and it's not connected to, you know, like the scriptures have no real connection, and the culture and the politics and the history has no connection. And, you know, you can learn a lot about Christianity by studying a certain period of time in ancient Israel, right? And you can learn very little about Christianity if all that you study is, say, the history of the Russian Orthodox Church in the 17th century. You know, like, it's just how it is. The Russian Orthodox Church might be interesting. But in this way, there's this very strange, distortion that creeps in. However, it creeps in for a reason. These decisions ultimately are made by particular professors with particular fantasies, with particular axes to grind, with this kind of thing. So I just say, it may seem random, but it's not. And I do think, to my knowledge, it's pretty much an official government policy and an official academic university policy in Germany. I do think there has been a conscious attempt to project the philosophical importance of Germans and to try to find and promote the philosophers they consider to be not fascist, not racist, et cetera, et cetera. And they failed, because guess what? The philosophy of Hegel is so close to fascism and is so racist and is so Christian, you might as well be reading a Nazi philosopher. Admittedly, he's not quite that bad. He's almost that bad. The philosophy of Immanuel Kant, the philosophy of these other guys that are held up. You would be much better off promoting the people who were their inveterate critics. So again, within 19th century Germany, has anyone here read Feuerbach, Wesen des Christentums? This has become obscure. Has anyone read Max Stirner? We've talked a lot about Max Stirner on this channel. There are some dissident voices. There are anti-Christian, anti-establishment voices, so on and so forth. Okay, I'll just read a couple more comments here coming in. Right. So Frida asks, who gets to choose the curricula of philosophy courses? Well, in Canada, none of this comes from the government. And I've been in conflict with professors before where I challenged that. So at the University of Toronto, I formally, went and made a complaint and had meetings with the professors. And I said, look, I've been here for so many years. I've been there for a lot of years at that point. And every single one of your courses is just about Hegel, Kant, Nietzsche. That's it. That's all I can study in your department. And okay, to be fair, I had taken the one course on Plato already. There was a little bit of ancient Greek. But so, and I was pointing out philosophers that had never been covered, that had never been taught. And I went through the records of the last time Arthur Schopenhauer had been taught. And it was really just one example for me. It wasn't really that I was committed to Schopenhauer. I wasn't a, devotee or disciple of Schopenhauer. But it was something like, look, I went through the records, and the last time Schopenhauer was taught, the last time it was taught was 1976 or something. So they are decisions made by small numbers of human beings. And most of those human beings are kind of gormless conformists who don't ask these questions. Let's be all the way real. They do not question, how will this help my students? They do not question, what is the use of this for my students? They think, oh, Thomas Hobbes, this is a great book. This is an important book. The book is important. We have to do justice to the book, so we have to force the students to read the book. Oh, Immanuel Kant, that's an important book. Oh, as if this is an inherent quality in the book. This is an important book. We have to teach the students Immanuel Kant. And then if you ask any of these other questions, why isn't Condorcet on the list? Oh, I'm sorry. We have so many great and important books. We just, there's no room on the shelf. There's no room in the course anymore. And there is absolutely no questioning of, I'm sorry, what is the competence the student is supposed to gain? What's the job they're supposed to be able to do ultimately? What is it they're supposed to learn? Now, I just say, I've always been a fan of area studies as an approach by contrast. So area studies, this is the technical term used. Area studies would instead have an approach like saying, okay, if you're going to understand the French Revolution, these are the people you have to read. So you have an area, France, and you have a period of time. Say, okay, we're going to do these 200 years in France. So who matters? Jean-Jacques Rousseau matters, Voltaire matters, Condorcet matters. Now we start to get a list of names that make sense, and they connect to each other in a way that makes sense. The definition of the department as philosophy, per se, or the definition of the department, even worse, politics. You have a department that's just called politics. So you walk in and say, elections in Egypt. What do you got for me? And they say, oh, no, we don't do that here. We do politics. What do you mean? This is the Department of Politics. Who's going to cover elections in Egypt? What other department is there? Now, if you have area studies, that would cover that. You could have an area studies department that covers Egypt and Syria or something. You could have a department specialized in the Middle East. But if you have a department that's called philosophy, you have a department that's called politics, none of them will cover it. they will all unquestioningly follow a canon of so-called great books from so-called great dead white men. It's just unquestioned Eurocentric assumption. And then, guys, the last several years, I've been doing China. China is not a marginal country. Not now, not 500 years ago, not 1,000 years ago. China's a big deal now. It's been a big deal for thousands of years, right? You walk in and go, oh, okay. So what have you guys got on China? Nothing, right? So before, I had to have a kind of humility. When I was doing like Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, like I understood. I'd come into the room and be like, look, I've been doing politics and history and philosophy in this part of the world. I understand you guys have nothing for me, but how are we going to make this work? Now I'm doing China for several years. And it's like, really, bro? Really? You're out here teaching Thomas Hobbes. You're out here teaching Immanuel Kant and pretending that Immanuel Kant's essay, Immanuel Kant's pamphlet on perpetual peace, supposedly the invention of the United Nations, which, by the way, has worked out great, right? Like Immanuel Kant's pamphlet on perpetual peace is such a brilliant work of philosophy that today in Myanmar, they have democracy. And today in Israel and Palestine, they have peace. Because the United Nations is a huge success, right? It's been a really great idea, right? Well, and Yugoslavia and Haiti and any other example. Cambodia, any example of a UN intervention you can name. They're all really successful. It's worked out really great. Oh, and I'm sorry, where did this all begin again? Oh, have you heard of the Korean War? Do you know what the United Nations did in the Korean War? Oh, thank you, Immanuel Kant. Thank you for this fucking pamphlet that any high school student today could write. Let's just break it down. For those of you who don't know, perpetual peace. This is, my name is Immanuel Kant, and here is my essay on perpetual peace. Some people think that, people are always in civil war with other people. But when they have a government, they have no civil war because they all serve the same government. So they have peace. So, now we have this problem where one government has war with another government, but we can solve it the same way. You have another government. So now, the same way there's no civil war when you have a government, there's no international war when you have an international government because you have another. So there are no more problems. Yeah, bro. The Roman Empire, there was just no war in the whole history. It was just, bro, that totally worked. Why would you? Who could see anything wrong with going back, especially if it's a Eurocentric Roman Empire, especially if you're talking about white Europeans conquering Africa and the Middle East, which is exactly what you're talking about, right? Like, who can see a problem with how this is going to go? What's wrong with the French Empire, with the British Empire? Who would question this? Oh, Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace. Oh, yeah, sure. Bro, this is idiocy. And of course, in practice, the United Nations has been a disaster, in case you have difficulty interpreting sarcasm. But look, sorry. Right? Come back to the question. Let me just reread it a little bit, okay? So he says, all over the internet are lists and charts that contain many influential persons and philosophers. Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and many others leading up to 20th century thinkers. Okay. What did Kant and Hegel influence? What? You have to challenge that. Okay, I can tell you right now what Condorcet influenced, right? Condorcet influenced the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the whole history of the rest of the world. Condorcet, also a brilliant scientist, brilliant mathematician, influenced the history of science, right? His brilliance is proven. The consequences of his philosophy are proven. Okay, Machiavelli here, right? Machiavelli influenced the whole world. His work is still sold in airport bookstores. People want to read Machiavelli. People are forced to read Immanuel Kant, right? Like, he's influential intellectually, influential politically. And by the way, in his own life, he was a really important political leader. He influenced the history of Italy directly as a political leader. And that's why the book has this very tragic air. I was saying before that Immanuel Kant never left his hometown, never had direct experience with, real politics. Well, Machiavelli really did. Machiavelli had experience with the mud and blood and hypocrisy of politics. He had been tortured himself and beaten up himself, and he'd seen other men being tortured and killed and fighting in these wars. He knew war. He knew peace. He knew democracy. He was part of a democratic Republican government in Florence, and he saw that democracy fall apart. He saw it be conquered and turned into a kind of despotism. He saw the rise and fall of democracies, plural, within Italy during his lifetime. So you get that feeling, something you're never going to get from an imbecile like Immanuel Kant or GWF Hegel. All right, guys, I just say, so we are now 50 minutes into the live stream, 49 minutes and 40 seconds. 34 people in the audience. We have only 17 thumbs up. Now, I understand some of you are sitting on the fence and you're not sure if you want to hit the thumbs up button, but it will help people find the video. It will help more people see the live stream while it's going on. If while you're here, you hit thumbs up. I totally understand. You watch the first 10 minutes, you're like, I'm not sure is this going to be about veganism again? Is this going to be, I understand you're not sure if you want to hit the thumbs up, but okay, we're 40 minutes into it or whatever, 50 minutes in now. I dare to ask the question, could you hit the thumbs up button so more people will see the video and more people can join the conversation? Okay, as I've paused to ask you to hit the thumbs up button, I'll glance again. So, okay, great. So some of these questions, you're anticipating stuff I do want to talk about. Lilac Cloud says, I honestly expected some political philosophy, especially from the ancient Greeks, but it was mostly meaningless stuff about perception, that what we do actually exists. Bullshit. This is right. So this is the other thing. So, the guy's asking about reading the ancient Greeks and stuff. There are really meaningful works about politics and political philosophy from ancient Greece and really Rome. And I'm going to say this clearly. There are works of philosophy and politics and history from that period where you don't need my interpretation. You don't need someone reading between the lines to explain to you what's interesting about it. You know what I mean? It's right up there on the surface, what's interesting about it. And even if you're 19 years old or something, like if you're a younger person, you know what I mean? You're going to get what the point is. So I read in my last live stream from the first chapter of Appian, an ancient Roman historian of civil war. And you get a discussion about slavery and poverty and the struggle between the rich and the poor and the Senate. And it's about democracy and it's about the lack of democracy. And wow, right up on the surface, there's something really meaningful and really relevant to politics and life and philosophy as it is today. And it's meaningful to life as it exists today. And it's meaningful to human nature as it exists today. You can also read works, especially religious works, that are not meaningful to life today whatsoever. One of Melissa's comments when I first put together the reading list for her on ancient Greece and ancient Rome, she said she was surprised there was no mythology there. By the way, babe, do you want to grab the book? We have the book on yes, yeah. So just mention another great source book for understanding cultural and political context in ancient Greece and Rome is to read the Theater. So this is not like reading philosophy or reading politics, but in reading Aristophanes, this is a book we got recently. I think this was a gift from the audience. So quite a few of these books I'm holding up were actually given us by viewers like you. So Condorcet on Modernity, this was a gift from a viewer. I didn't have to pay for this myself. And this book on Aristophanes. The subtitle here is Critique of the Gods. So this is especially drawing attention to the way in which Aristophanes is a heretic or an atheist. He's a skeptic about religion. And he's cross-examining and criticizing ideas. So there's a moment in one of his plays where the main character renounces his religion, and he has a small statue. I think it was to Hermes, the messenger god, but maybe I'm forgetting which god it was. But he has a small statue to one of the gods. It's not Zeus. It's one of the smaller gods. And he reviles the statue. He says, oh, to think that I used to worship a statue. Now I have philosophy. Now I'm intellectual. Now I know this is just carved out of wood. I don't worship a statue anymore. And then later, as the drama progresses, he becomes disillusioned with the philosophy of Socrates. And he goes back to the statue. He takes the statue back and he puts it up on its alcove and he worships the statue again. So you do get this kind of commentary. You do get a sense of it. But look, there are books from ancient Greece and ancient Rome that are complete bullshit. And I would say, as an easy example, the stuff about religious mythology is bullshit, right? Now, within European philosophy broadly, why is it that Lilac Cloud, so Lilac Cloud is old enough that he or she has already been to university, right? Why is it that when you enrolled in this course in philosophy, you were taught nothing but meaningless questions about perception, that do we really exist, etc.? It's a choice. right? Like, people are making these choices. What you learn at university doesn't have to be useless, but it is. And nobody is questioning what kind of life they're preparing you for, what it is you're supposed to know. And I just say, the bad old days of the British Empire, the bad old days of, classicism, classical studies in England and the United States of America, one of the reasons why they studied more meaningful philosophy in a more meaningful way was that they openly said they were preparing you for life as a soldier and life as a political leader of men. So what did you read? And how did you read it? You read Seneca, and you read Aristotle's rhetoric, and you learned this is what it's like to stand up in front of an audience, whether that's parliament or whether that's other soldiers in your unit, and make an argument for what you think we need to do next when your life is literally on the line. And they read Xenophon's Anabasis. That was always the level 1 reading. That's where you'd start with the class. The first thing you'd read, Xenophon, he depicts soldiers in a democracy. The soldiers elect their leader directly. Their commanders are elected by the men. And when the commanders explain their plan for what they're going to do next, they have to convince their men. They have to get a vote, right? It's not a question of blind obedience to authority. And why was this taught to young men? They were preparing young men for what was thought of as a meaningful life, a life of taking responsibility. Now, of course, whether they went into business or whether they went into war or went into government or what have you, it was saying, look, we are providing you with this preparation. Whether that is reading Appian or Livy or Sallust or Aristotle. Now, I'll give you a counterexample. Within Aristotle, so I just said you can read Aristotle's Politics, you can read Aristotle's Rhetoric, you can read Aristotle's Constitution of Athens. Those are meaningful texts. I would say that Aristotle's Metaphysics is completely meaningless for people today. The only reason to read Aristotle's Metaphysics is to understand its influence on the Catholic Church. So the development of the Catholic Church, the development of Neoplatonism and the Catholic and even the Protestant Church, that's a totally different province, frankly, of bullshit. So you could have a fascinating university course that's really useful for people today, really dealing with political and philosophical ideas that are in Aristotle. But you could, just by the different selection of texts with a different bias, have a course that's really a complete waste of your time. I would just say also, I feel that Aristotle's book Ethics is completely useless for people. It's a waste of your time. There are a few paragraphs in Ethics that are relevant, and they're often quoted in the footnotes to copies of Aristotle's Politics. Because like during Politics, they'll say, oh, there's a similar passage in Ethics here and there. But so just say there are some books by Aristotle that are a complete waste of your time. And it is not a coincidence that those are the kind of true believer religious bullshit books within Aristotle's own milieu. And by the way, if you don't know, long story short, the Catholic Church, it went through a period where they were burning Aristotle's books. And then they had, formal conclaves and discussions of this. Oh, hey, wait. It turns out Aristotle isn't such a bad pagan after all. His philosophy is pretty close to our philosophy. And then everything switched. And the Catholic Church started interpreting Aristotle to be a Christian before Christ. And the ultimate emblematization of this, the taking of this bizarre cultural hybridity, this reclaiming of certain aspects of classicism in the dark ages of Christianity, comes in the middle of Dante's Inferno. So Dante's Inferno was a famous book of fiction. It's not fact. It's not a documentary. It's a fictional account of a man who travels to hell and then walks to paradise. You can walk from hell to heaven. Again, not a documentary, but there's a stage where he walks past the Christians before Christianity. They have a special place in limbo. So he walks past Socrates and Aristotle and these people. So there was a recognition that there were these people who were so intelligent that before Christ brought his message to the world and before Europeans started converting to a form of Judaism, which is what Christianity is, that they figured out, the mystery of the one true God or something. So yeah, this is a digression to say it is possible to have courses that are complete bullshit, working even from these same sources of these same authors that I'm praising. But, okay, I mean, nobody told me about Thucydides. Nobody told me about Appian. Nobody told me about Livy. I come from a similarly benighted educational background. If you went to, the Department of Philosophy at University of Toronto, I've already said, all you ever heard about basically at that time was Hegel and Nietzsche. Oh, right, and I'm sorry, talk about a digression from a digression. When you read these names, so I was asking the question, why do you think Kant is important? Why do you think Hegel is important? It's only important from two perspectives. One is a kind of crypto-fascist Christian conservative view of the world that doesn't exist in the 21st century. It was a form of Christian conservatism that existed in the 19th century, right? That's one perspective from which names like, Hobbes also, but Hobbes and Hegel and Kant and so on matter. And then the other perspective, of course, is Karl Marx. It's the attempt of Marxists to make Marxism seem like the completion of a philosophy that began with Hegel, which is completely ridiculous and counterproductive. But Marxists often try to do this thing like, oh, no, man, if you really want to understand the roots of Marxism, you got to go back to Hegel, which is, again, a complete waste of your time, especially compared to reading, Appian or Sallust or Condorcet or Machiavelli or all kinds of things that are much more worth reading, given that you have only so many years on this planet. So Menelnik M comments, the UN is actually pretty legit. So I don't know if you're still in the crowd, Menelnik. I disagree. Okay. And, challenge yourself in this way. Why don't you look up how the salaries are established for the United Nations? And why don't you look up how voting works at the United Nations? There is a reason why the United Nations can never accomplish anything in the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's a reason why they never accomplished anything positive in Cambodia or Haiti or anywhere else. Structurally, it is at best a flawed design. Procedurally, it is incapable of making precisely the difference in the world it promises to make. And every single employee of the United Nations is paid more to do their job than they would be paid if doing an equivalent job in the highest paid country anywhere in the world. So let's say you're an agricultural advisor for the United Nations being sent to Laos or Cambodia. Those are people I used to meet. So they look at how much is an agricultural expert paid in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in the United States of America, and they pay you more than that. And then you go to a country like Laos or Cambodia, where the cost of living is very low. There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of explicit, overt corruption involved. And the people who make decisions about Cambodia at the United Nations know less about Cambodia than I do. So this is a brief digression, but it's worth saying. Why did the British Empire fail? Why did the British Empire have to fail? You had people in London making decisions about Myanmar who had never been to Myanmar, who was then called Burma. You had people in London making decisions, yes, about places like Laos and Cambodia, who never gone there, who didn't know the language, who didn't know anything about it, who didn't understand the cultural, let alone political context, okay? The United Nations, as it exists now, reproduces these awful features of imperialism. And that is seen in how awful the outcomes are, whether it is in Haiti or Cambodia or Tibet or right now in Myanmar. This is 2021. If you think the United Nations is pretty legit, Menelnik, all right, what are your predictions? What are your predictions between 2021 and 2022 for what the United Nations is going to do in Myanmar? Right? And my prediction is jack shit. And meanwhile, you can just look at the fucking grocery bill. You can see just how much money is being spent to accomplish jack shit. And guys, I'll give you two examples. There were meetings at the UN where they were spending millions of dollars just to have the meeting. Just the cost of putting everyone in a 5-star hotel, and each one of these people is being paid a salary over $100,000. You're spending a huge amount of money to have a meeting. And they hear and listen to a bunch of reports about indigenous peoples and how oppressed they are. And they vote and they sagaciously decide to grant $300 for some, indigenous peoples, program. Any aspect of the UN, whether you're looking at it in terms of environment, veganism, like, Food and Agriculture Organization, the advocacy for the meat industry versus eliminating meat and pursuing a vegan diet, a vegan word. When you look at the ecological side, it's bullshit. When you look at the war and peace side, when you look at the endangered languages, indigenous people side, there is no aspect of the UN I can speak about positively. And when the cost is that high, you have to have some kind of standard. So if we took that same money and just gave it to the indigenous people, just handed it to them, instead of having this meeting, we just said, hey, you figure out how to teach your language and stop your language from going extinct. Instead of us having a UN, the outcomes are better. I have to say too, I've read direct transcripts of the UN meetings on Cambodia, and all the people at those meetings know less about Cambodia than I do. And it's sickening. And by the way, they're from all around the world. So like there's somebody there from India on the microphone talking about the stuff about Cambodia. And they're like, they're supposedly going to improve women's rights in Cambodia or some shit, Woo, at every stage, it's scary. So it's not just white Europeans who are ignorant about Cambodia or ignorant about Haiti. Right? It'd be the same thing. If you look at the stuff on Haiti, well, yeah, you got some people from India, you got some people from Saudi Arabia, you got representatives from around the world, and they're all completely ignorant of the cultural and political situation in Haiti. And there were millions of dollars being wasted and so on and so forth. So the track record of failure at the United Nations, it reflects deep and shallow problems with the United Nations. Okay. Anyway, guys, thanks for making intelligent comments. I mean, I do appreciate it. Can I just try to catch up here? Okay. So Doom 1063 asks, isn't Hobbes valuable because he was the first social contract theorist who based political legitimacy outside of religion? That is completely false. So Doom, that is a fascinating example of a statement, every single aspect of which is false. Yeah, I can talk about how Hobbes fits into social contract, but no, absolutely nothing you've just said is correct. And no, his theory of state and government is by no means a secular one or outside of religion. But no, I mean, I don't know who would have possibly told you that. But anyway, Radical Centrist is asking again about the history of economics. Yup, you can go back and watch the video so you remember what it is. Yeah, I remember I did make videos talking about Karl Marx and the origins, the pre-Marxist history of economics and how Marxism has distorted the way we now remember economics. Go back, just search my channel for Karl Marx. And guys, I'll give this, if you're having trouble, because YouTube, it is not easy to search the database of more than 2,000 videos on my channel. So, sorry, who is this? Radical Centrist? Check out this link. You can search here for the word Marx. But I think there are only about 2 videos I did on Marx, maybe 3. Okay, maybe it's 5. But anyway, there aren't that many. You can just search for the word Marx there, and you'll get the videos too. That stuff. We have a question. Sorry, I've many articles and many videos about Buddhism. We have a question from DDP. Do you believe the Buddha was mythical? So I have written articles dealing with that, but I also have enough videos about it. You could search my channel for the word apotheosis. I'll give you that link. That's a good place to start. But yeah, I have written articles also in addition to making videos discussing that question. So this is DDP. But there's a video to get you started. You can watch some of the other videos or read some of my articles in print. Frida is asking, is Cicero worth reading? So Frida, stay tuned. Most of Cicero is not worth reading. So quite a long time ago on the channel, I talked about his work, De Republica, on the Republic of the Republic. For most people, that is not worth reading. I read it. I will make videos in the future talking about Cicero's lectures or declamations, and there may be some bits and pieces worth reading, or I may say to you, don't waste your time. Just watch my YouTube videos talking about it. So, a lot of Cicero is not worth your time, but obviously a tremendously influential author. So, in this sense, Sorry, I don't have an official whistling policy. Okay, Lila Cloud, this is your first time, but Lila Cloud agrees with me about the United Nations. Lila Cloud says, quote, the UN peacekeepers are also a sick joke. They're notorious for their abuse. I heard they somewhat helped the situation in Bosnia in the 90s, but I haven't looked into it properly. Yeah. So, the recent scandals in Haiti, I think, were the ones that drew people's attention most, to the extent to which the UN peacekeepers are their own source of rape and human rights abuses. That they all the same problems you could have with a national army, you can have, and more. You can have even worse with with the United Nations Army. So an army is an army, and again, you can get into organizationally. Who are the soldiers? Who do they report to? Where were they trained? Because the United Nations isn't a separate country. Why does that work out so much worse than having the Swiss show up and act as peacekeepers, whatever? But look, let's just also say very briefly the whole history of the United Nations stage managing elections has gone very poorly. And why is it that so few countries have succeeded in making the transition to democracy? Okay, Egypt. Egypt has 100 million people. Doesn't democracy in Egypt matter? Doesn't it matter to the United Nations? Like, I admit, maybe Myanmar is not your top priority. Well, what about Russia? What about Ukraine? I mean, it seems like, Ukraine is another great example. Why does the United Nations not seem to care about Ukraine? Oh, hey, have you heard about a little island just south of Turkey called Cyprus, in Greek pronounced Kupros? Have you thought about the record of the United Nations on Cyprus? Scary. It's so bad, it's scary. And yeah, there are UN peacekeepers there basically permanently for decades and decades, and it doesn't solve the problem. So yeah, we have a problem in our culture of perceiving weakness as strength, of perceiving failure as success and success as failure. And the United Nations is a sterling example of that. Okay, do I have anything else to say about this? I'm going to read the conclusion of this question one more time. All right. The big picture question that I couldn't find answers to is, why are all of these thinkers being taught in universities? Why should I or society care for them? Should I skip them or read a select few? My current plan is to go through your and Melissa's list, and after I finish with it, I'll start with Descartes and the lot. So this is Thomas More, Utopia, Hobbes, and then Descartes. Look, my advice is kind of parallel to and similar to what I said earlier about the difference between area studies and these definitions that are more abstract, like philosophy and politics as a topic. If you just study politics as defined in a Eurocentric way, you're never going to do politics of Japan. You're never going to do politics of Sri Lanka. You're never going to do politics of, Egypt or whatever. You're never going to do politics of anywhere. I mean, also, if you do politics in university, you're never really going to do politics of England. I mean, it's pathetic. I mean, I mentioned recently in a video at some length, you never learn anything about Italy. I mean, Italy really matters. All these places matter. I think the way to approach this kind of reading is through a series of projects. Babe, could you grab just a couple of your Central Asia books? Just whatever's handy. Grab like 2 of them and bring them over to me. I keep saying I'm going to do a video talking about Napoleon, right? Now, I don't think you should do a research project about one man, in the same way that I don't think you should read any of these people kind of in isolation. Definitely don't read Descartes in isolation. Don't read Hobbes in isolation. Don't read Hegel in isolation. It's meaningless, right? But if you said, okay, I want to understand what happened in the 50 years leading up to the French Revolution and in the 50 years after the French Revolution, then obviously Napoleon becomes meaningful. But also the amount of reading you do becomes finite rather than infinite. It's not like, oh, I'm going to read the complete works. I'm going to read the whole bookshelf on Napoleon, right? Now, also, if you do that, and if you're being honest with yourself what your interest is, I would say, for example, atheism becomes a crucial question. Okay, so in the 50 years before the French Revolution, what was going on in terms of religion and atheism? Oh, well, all of a sudden now, there emerges as a really important author, someone like Holbach, someone like Helvetius. So I'm just going to type these out. So you may not have heard of these authors. No, this is part of why Western academia sucks, why our high school education sucks, and also our university education sucks. Now, from this perspective, you say, okay, I'm taking on a job. Maybe, again, start a YouTube channel, start a blog, or start writing articles, do whatever you want to do. But if you have a YouTube channel and say, okay, I am going to do a series of videos where I summarize my conclusions and my findings about what happened 50 years leading up to the French Revolution, 50 years after. Okay, and I'm being honest about what my interests are. So I'm interested in slavery because I'm alive in the 21st century. I'm interested in racism against black people. I'm interested in atheism versus Christianity. Maybe you're also interested in the status of women. Like maybe, maybe not. Let's just say hypothetically, given who's in my audience, who I'm talking to, maybe you're interested in how ancient Greek ideas and how ancient Roman ideas got reinterpreted and reinvented in that period in France, or that period in Western Europe, right? Okay, so now you've got a bunch of interests. And now Napoleon fits into that as one puzzle piece. And you're going to do a certain amount of reading about Napoleon, but you're not going to let it take over decades of your life. But now also people like Holbach and Helvetius, and probably also, Condorcet here, whose book I keep holding up, probably these other thinkers start to fit in as puzzle pieces. And now you have a sense of mission. You have a sense of purpose. You know what it is you want to understand. Now, I just say, I'm not praising Condorcet in a one-sided way here. Another question you might have in looking at that period of 100 years is, what did these people have to say about the American Revolution? Because these things happened almost simultaneously. You have the unfolding of American politics and French politics. I think what Condorcet says about the American Revolution is kind of dumb. It's interesting. I'm glad I read it, But you look at it, he's like, oh yeah, they're going to abolish slavery any day now. Oh, the American Revolution is going great. It's just a matter of time before they abolish slavery and give equal rights to black people. Guess again, Condorcet, he was quite naive. He was quite jejune quite naive about relationship with the First Nations people, the indigenous people too, the genocide. There were things he was just wrong about. His heart was in the right place, but he was wrong about these things. So, but when you have that sense of mission and purpose, you're then not going to be disappointed. You're not going to be frustrated with that because your analysis of that fits into that puzzle. These are puzzle pieces fitting into your project. And now later, after you've done that, if you want to especially read more about Napoleon or especially read more about slavery or what was going on in, these different things, when you teach philosophy that way, when you teach politics that way, or when you teach yourself that way, you gain competence. You gain a skill that you can use in the real world, and it still matters now. Like still today, you will be hearing about the ban on headscarves in France and Quebec. There is the struggle between secularism and organized religion in French politics still to this day. That 100% has its origins in the French Revolution and Napoleon. Like French Revolution was one thesis and Napoleon was a counter thesis. You know what I mean? And one was moving in one direction, one moving in the other. And that the compromise between the two forces, you can say, produced the legal and political and cultural framework that still carries on to this day. And you will find, if you read this way, you've gained real competence. If you read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan in isolation, you gain no competence. If you read Kant in isolation, if you read Hegel in isolation, if you read Descartes in isolation, and the worst thing is the main way these people read these books is just, oh, this man was a genius. He was a great man. Don't question why he was a genius. Don't question what he discovered or what he accomplished or what his influence on civilization is. You read it in this isolated way where you gain no competence and no comparative awareness either. So just to finish that example of the French Revolution, learning about the French Revolution that way, you will not regard Napoleon as a genius if you're reading him in that way, in that context. I don't think you'll regard any of them as geniuses. Like Holbach and Helvetius, the two guys I just mentioned, you would see them as people who were competing with other authors, right? You're like, oh yeah, so this was one guy who had a hit book and he was kind of responding to and competing with this other guy who had a hit book, and all these people influenced Napoleon, and Napoleon was imitating this guy and writing this. You get a sense of the political and intellectual and philosophical competition going on in all directions and pushing and pulling at the Republic all at the same time, and then you get a sense of how it unfolds. So again, that's very different from the way academia, at least English-speaking academia in the West, it puts these people on a pedestal. And I'll just really brief, sorry, I could talk about this all day. That's what I see done with Socrates too, right? She says, oh, what do you need to know about Socrates? That Socrates was a great man, and he's presented in isolation in this bizarre way that makes him meaningless. And no, that's not who Socrates was. That's not why he mattered. Socrates, sorry, we had the book. Yeah. In reality, Socrates was the butt of many jokes in Athens. They didn't think he was a great man, and they killed him, in case you hadn't heard. Hashtag spoilers. And story ends with Socrates dead. He was given a public trial and sentenced to death and executed. So they didn't think he was a great man. And he was one guy competing with these other cultural forces. And, and that included religious as well as, political and philosophical voices. That he was one voice putting his hat into the ring. And he was saying, no, I know what the government ought to be. I know how politics ought to be organized and run. This is my, bid for power. And he got involved with a guy named Alcibiades and really tried to change government and politics in Athens in the middle of an ongoing civil war and so on. So anyway, yeah. I remember I got a peer review, very negative peer review for one of my essays. I think this was one of the essays that got published in the end. I had essays that went through peer review, they get rejected, and then they get accepted or whatever. But remember one guy wrote back just snubbing my essay and saying, oh, well, this is just making the point that content needs to be understood in context. That's not new. Like there's nothing touches. I remember reading that. You can imagine this was actually someone who's a religious Buddhist and is looking for an excuse to shut down my article because my articles really call into question and condemn a lot of things that are precious and holy to religious Buddhists. And their faith is blind faith. It's based on ignorance and it's often contradicted by the text. And I remember thinking, you're wrong. Arguing for content in context is never going to go out of style. It's never going to. This is never going to not matter. It's like your whole life, people are going to say something about Napoleon, and you're going to have to say back, well, yes, but he was only doing that because at the same time this was happening. Your whole life, people are going to make a statement like this about how Thomas Hobbes invented some concept. And you say, no, he was responding to these other people, and this is what was going on. And that's an intellectual tradition that goes all the way back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and blah, blah. No, this is not true at all. No, arguing for, struggling for, understanding content in context, it never goes away. It never gets old. It happens again and again. So just mention this book was literally on Melissa's desk when I asked her to grab it for me. But this is an example of area studies, an approach where you say, okay, I'm going to understand the border between Central Asia and China. I'm going to understand this region of Xinjiang, Western China, into Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc. I'm going to understand what it's all about. So if you didn't have this project, if you didn't kind of take it, so it exists on a map geographically, it also exists chronologically, right? Because you're not going back 3,000 years, right? Mostly it's the last 300 years, maybe 500, but mostly the last 300 years. So, okay, what happened in the last 300 years that produced this situation in Xinjiang? It involves China, it involves Russia. By the way, Russia is very much involved. It involves Turkey, at least a little bit. You know what I mean? It involves Iran, right? It's a really politically contentious part of the world. Okay, and then these people in between, the Uzbeks, the Turkmenistanis, the Turkmen, the Kyrgyz, and the residents of Xinjiang, right? They're caught in the middle of this. Right. Okay. If you didn't have that context, we could pick out the name of any one of these political figures and say, oh, are you interested in reading about this guy's political philosophy? No, not at all. I know Turkmen Bashi or something, one of these leaders, So, oh, do you want to read about the philosophy of Turkmen Bashi? No, right? It's not significant. It's not meaningful. It's not motivating in isolation. But if you take on the task of saying, look, I'm not going to understand what's happening in Xinjiang in the context of this bullshit propaganda narrative that's being presented to the world on CNN right now. I'm going to understand it in terms of the context of 300 years of history that involves the Qing dynasty in China. It involves these different political figures and religious movements in Central Asia. And, there are really interesting questions here about the future of Islam and the future of atheism and secularism and the future of democracy on planet Earth. This becomes meaningful. This becomes rewarding. This becomes interesting, and it breathes life into what would otherwise be a completely boring set of isolated texts and isolated ideas. So that's ultimately the end of my answer. A long and thorough and in-depth answer to this question sent in by a viewer in the audience and a supporter on Patreon. Shout out to Danny.